Hello, students. In this episode of Neurons on Fire, we're going to look at the study skill of rehearsing and memorizing your study materials. Essentially, what we're talking about here is memory techniques. So in the last slide, I mentioned the word rehearsal. And you may be wondering, well, what exactly does rehearsal mean with reference to my study materials? Basically, rehearsal is just a fancy word for efforts to remember something. So we want to be able to remember, we want to be able to recall the information that we have studied. And ultimately, our goal is to strengthen our neural network, right? And the way in which we strengthen our neural net is we need to use as many different types of memory strategies or rehearsal strategies as we can. And we also need to distribute those efforts over time. So it's not a one-time shot. It's something that we work with, we continually build, and we continually process in order to develop that very strong neural net. So we've established that the word rehearsal means efforts to remember things. But really, when we're talking about studying your materials, we're really focusing on two things, right? We're focusing on remembering and understanding. And of course, these two concepts are tied, but they also can be different. So remembering is just being able to recall information. Understanding takes it to a higher level. So we can recall things, we can remember things, but it doesn't necessarily mean that we understand them. But to understand them, we definitely do have to be able to remember them. Okay, so in that discussion of remembering and understanding, obviously our goal is to do both. We want to understand it, we want to remember it. But there are actually two different kinds of rehearsal strategies. So there's what's called elaborative rehearsal and there's rote rehearsal. So let's first of all talk about elaborative rehearsal. This is the one that focuses on that deep, long-lasting learning. So we really want to focus on elaborative rehearsal. And it means that we're not only remembering things, we're not only able to recall them, but we actually understand them. So that means this type of rehearsal focuses on the meanings of things, and it focuses on looking at the relationship between ideas. And it's also the type of rehearsal that actually connects your old knowledge and your new knowledge together. So that's the one we want to focus on. Rote rehearsal is sometimes necessary, but it's not the one that we necessarily want to focus on. This one is more about the actual recalling or remembering. It doesn't necessarily mean that we understand it. It's more of that very surface level of processing. We're kind of memorizing by just sheer repetition, right? Just getting it in our head. It doesn't necessarily mean we understand it. So really there's goods and bads with the rote rehearsal. And sometimes in life we need to just flat out kind of memorize things. So in the past, your textbook mentions that, you probably memorize the alphabet and the multiplication tables and so forth. And that's fine, right? It's come in handy for us. But it can be bad if it's mindless memorization and it makes us think that we actually understand something when all we're doing is really regurgitating it. We're just kind of barfing it back. So when you think about this, for example, somebody can rote memorize a mathematical formula. Like a lot of times we do, we kind of memorize the formula and then we plug and chug, right? We apply the information. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we understand why it works or we can necessarily apply it. So remembering is the basic level, but understanding takes it to a higher level. So both of these strategies have a place in our learning. Of course, we tend to want to focus more on elaborative rehearsal, but definitely use elaborative rehearsal when you're learning and you're trying to remember complex ideas and relationships. The rote rehearsal, the rote memorization, is more from when you're trying to memorize like facts and details. Just like what we talked about when we looked at reading and note-taking and organizing, when it comes to this idea of rehearsing and memorizing and memory techniques, there are three different time periods by which we should be working. One is before, one is during, and one is after. Again, it's not just the during, the process of doing the rehearsing and memorizing. So please, in your textbook, read about all of the different strategies, find some things that you don't do, and try them out. As far as I'm concerned, all of the strategies that your book gives are excellent, but I just want to share some of the ones that I do. So in terms of the before, what can you do before to help the memory technique process? And one of the things that I do, and I'm a huge advocate for my students doing this, is to distribute your learning over time. And the example they give in your textbook is fantastic. You know, you have two students who have, 20 hours to study, whatever, okay? And one of the students sits down in literally the 24 hours before the test, and they study kind of like straight for those 20 hours. 20 of the 24. And then you have another student who, you know, looks at the course schedule and sees, okay, we're going to be covering this concept for 10 days or whatever. And every day for 10 days, they study 2 hours a day. Okay, so by the end of the time, both students have studied 20 hours, but the student who distributed the learning over time is going to have the kind of long-lasting, deep ingraining in their memory information. So it's a better way to go. This is also true of any one study session. So let's say you have, 120 minutes to study. You have 2 hours to study. Some students just sit down for 2 hours and they take in the information, right? But the thing is, we tend to remember like the first 10 minutes, the last 10 minutes, give or take some minutes. We tend to remember the first chunk of information, the last chunk of information, and kind of some of the interesting, funny, relevant things in the middle. So for that student studying for 120 minutes, they're remembering 20, 30 minutes of material, right? Versus a student who does, they say the same thing about distributing their learning. They're like, I'm going to study for 20 minutes, take a 10-minute break. I'm going to study for 20 minutes, I'm going to take a 10-minute break. And they do this 6 times. So in the end, right, each of those 20-minute study sessions, they are actually retaining all of the information. So for all the time that they're actually studying and not taking a break, they're actually remembering everything. So that distributing your learning over time is a really awesome one. Now, what can you do during, or what do I do during? Well, two of the biggest things that I do is I review my study materials and I recite my study materials. And what's the difference? Very subtle, but there is a difference. So basically, when you're reviewing or reciting your materials, you're going through your notes, your study materials, and you're constantly asking questions about and answering those questions of, what's the key concept? What are the main ideas? What are the supporting facts? What are the examples? When you are just reviewing it, right? When you're reviewing it, you are just thinking about it, like you're mentally thinking, right? When you're reciting it, you're actually saying it aloud. And I do both of those. And another thing that I do during is I use different kind of mnemonic techniques, not demonic, but mnemonic techniques, memory techniques. I use acronyms, I use acrostics, I use association. I actually use a lot of different techniques. It depends on what the subject is. But acronyms are basically is a word made from the first letters of other words. And your book gives great examples, like you're trying to memorize the Great Lakes, a geographic feature in the United States. And you say Holmes, which stands for each of the Great Lakes, Huron, Ontario, Michigan, Erie, and Superior. I also use acrostic, which instead of being a word made of the first letter of other words, it's actually kind of a sentence made from the first letter of other words. And so I know we've all done this historically because the book's examples we actually have used in school, right? When you're learning the biological taxonomy and you go kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. The one they have in the book is fine, but we wanted, kids, you're teenagers and you're laughing about stuff. So we said King Philip came over for good sex, right? And then the musical staff one, everybody knows that one. Every good boy does fine. Everybody knows the one for order of operations and math. Please excuse my dear Aunt Sally. Associations are awesome. Association is when you're trying to learn something new and you connect it to something you already know to make it a little easier. And in fact, I do this all the time with names. So the president of your college is named Dr. Reed. We actually have a psychology instructor also named Dr. Reed. And so like if you're trying to memorize that name, I think of somebody playing a clarinet in kind of like a marshy swamp, okay? Let's say another instructor you're meeting, Dr. Linda Jackson, who's a psychology instructor. And Dr. Jackson's a super cool instructor, and she drives a Harley, and she wears a leather jacket sometimes. And so I think of her wearing her leather jacket and singing Michael Jackson's Thriller. Okay, Thriller. Okay, so that's how the word or the association game works. When it comes to after, the strategies in the book are fantastic. Obviously, nothing beats reviewing. Go over it, over it, over it, over it, over it. That's how you remember things, is through review. And then lastly, lately, I have found it so awesome to learn by teaching other people. Now, I start off by reciting it and I stand in front of a mirror in like the bathroom or my bedroom, and I actually kind of deliver a lecture of what I learned, or I practice my notes. It's even better if you have a friend or a significant other and you're excited about the information you learned in class and you want to tell somebody or your parents, and you're kind of teaching the lesson. So it's a really awesome way to practice and work with information. Plus, there's an emotional component because you're maybe kind of passionate and interested in doing it. So I hope these strategies help. Read them over, try something new, and keep building that neural net.